This is Spotify. This is anger. And this is a musician. And this is the real reason why musicians are angry at Spotify and what they can do to fix it. Spotify doesn't seem to care, but we as musicians need to be super clear around what we need them to do to fix it. The first thing on my mind is, how did they manage to piss off so many people? Also, I've been wondering, since when did it be okay to combine music with war? And I promise there are a lot more areas that we're going to cover off in this video. So I've been spending a bit of time really trying to get to the bottom of some of these issues and lots of other ones. So many of my colleagues, other musicians, have all expressed the same thing: anger. Anger at Spotify. So I did a bit of digging. Now let's go right back to the beginning. So I know Spotify came along, they really solved everybody's problem, and but I'm not really buying it, because back then I was perfectly comfortable with going into iTunes and downloading a song and then being able to play it on my phone. And I don't know if you remember, but Spotify wasn't really easy to get on your phone initially. And so I was perfectly comfortable with being able to listen to iTunes. The idea of trying to put the music from my digital downloads that I'd ripped from my own CD collection onto a phone, it was too hard. I couldn't actually do it. I was trying to put them on iTunes and iTunes would mess up. So in a way, I just got used to listening to iTunes. I bought albums, new albums. If I wanted to listen to old stuff, I could as well. I'd probably listen to it on my laptop or whatever. But the thing is that I didn't really need to have access to the whole entire catalog of the world's music for $10 or $5 or whatever it was back then. And so right from the get-go, I think their business model was kind of flawed. But look, who am I to say? A lot of people like Spotify, a lot of people jumped on the bandwagon, and loads of them got into Spotify, and that was fine. For those of you that don't know, Spotify was founded back in 2006 in Sweden. Two guys, Martin and Daniel, got together and they founded Spotify. They then spent 2 years negotiating, fighting, working with record labels to come up with a solution where they would be able to get licensed for their music. But it hasn't been altogether an easy ride. And since then, Spotify has been trying to make their business model profitable for a very, very long time. And it's only been really in the last year that they finally were able to do that, with a lot of the founders walking away with quite a lot of money. Now, we'll come back to what they did with their money in a second. Fast forward to today, Spotify remains the largest streaming platform out of all of them. And only recently they just renegotiated their contracts with some of the major record labels like Warner and Universal and Sony. But the journey hasn't been great, and there's been a big question mark about how royalties are to be handled around streaming. And that's probably one of the first things that really piss artists off. So let's talk really quickly about what happened in March 2025. Spotify was sued by the Mechanical Licensing Collective, who basically manage all of the rights for right holders in the US, but also in other parts of the world. And they were suing Spotify on the basis that they were bundling things like their audiobooks and their podcasting and some of their other services with music, which effectively meant that they were going to dilute the pool of money for music artists, and that was unfair. They claimed that they were depriving artists of over 150 million in royalties by doing that. And musicians, already angry about how little they were already making, saw this as a massive betrayal once more. We already know how little musicians get paid. They literally get 0.33 or whatever the pooled amount is for every stream, which is so little. And this came hot on the heels of deciding that they weren't going to pay musicians below 1,000 streams, all 8 million of them. Now, clearly, that was also a betrayal, and if you think about it, even though to the individual artists it was a small amount, it was still something. And to Spotify, we all know that by not having to pay that, it resulted in millions and millions and millions every month that they didn't have to pay out in small, little denominations. But the issue is that Spotify still benefits from over 8 million artists who put their music on Spotify in the hope that someone will listen to them. But unfortunately, none of those will get paid. So we have this lawsuit situation in the States, and then later in the year, they decided to lay off over 20% of the Spotify workforce. And that would impact everything from artist onboarding, any services around, artists that they would be using to try and promote people and help people, and really a lot of the R&D of the platform. So that's the second thing that really started to annoy artists, because they're not getting as much from the platform in terms of creative development and support. All of the different functions that are there to really support artists and help them to grow on the platform, they were all massively undercut. And this, of course, prompted a big backlash as well of a lot of the listeners and artists pushing back and talking about Spotify's practices where, they should be supporting new artists and actually putting more people on. And that was just another nail in the coffin for artists around how they treat their own staff, but not only that, the services that they provide to listeners and to other artists, especially when they're making record profits from streaming. And all of these layoffs already impacted a lot of the innovation that a lot of listeners felt was lacking. Like, for example, the shuffle feature. Yeah, sure, they came out with AI radio, but that wasn't what people wanted. They just wanted basic shuffle. The third thing that really pissed off a lot of people was the fact that they were promoting fake artists on some of their playlists. So it was discovered that there were these artists that were generating this kind of easy to listen to stuff, almost like kind of stock music, and they were promoting under lots and lots of different artist names. So I think they found one composer that had published works across 260 individual artists. And it was almost alleged that Spotify was actually behind a lot of this to try and save money and have composers on there generating these like fake artists and juicing the numbers. So that was already a big issue. And then we start to see AI artists start to be verified as actual artists. We all know the story of the Velvet Underground. They initially said that they were a proper band until they eventually came clean and came out saying, that they were actually an AI band. But still Spotify verified them as an artist in kind of contravention of some of the Spotify policies. So basically they weren't policing it. And in fact, you kind of go, well, given what they did with the other composers, could they be behind this whole push around AI artists? I mean, we do know that Daniel Ek in different interviews mentioned the drive to AI. And so you wouldn't be surprised if, in a bid to dilute the pool even further and get more profits out of the company, that they wouldn't be promoting AI artists as a way to, again, have a larger percentage of royalties going back to Spotify rather than to rights holders. And then the final blow was really where Daniel Ek decided that he was going to invest in a military startup specializing in AI and decided to put 700 million of his profits that he'd earned from Spotify into this other startup. And generally, it kind of flies in the face of what most musicians really think about. They're not really big on, using their music to fund wars and to fund military equipment. So that kind of felt like a bit of a punch in the guts to many different artists. And we're now seeing, a lot of backlash for that as well. So there are 5 things that really, really have pissed off musicians. So the implication of some of these things, and why is it that it's important to note that musicians are actually pissed off? It's that they're eroding the trust that they've built up over a very long time with recording artists who wanted to, in good faith, put their music on their platform, only to find out that the company's doing these kind of dodgy, kind of shady different things. So the first thing is trust. People aren't going to trust Spotify when they learn about all of this kind of dodgy behavior. And the other big point is, A lot of the traffic that Spotify gets comes from the artists themselves. They drive a lot of attention onto the platform because they want to promote their songs, they want to promote their music that they publish onto Spotify. So if those artists go away and take their music off the platform and no longer drive to Spotify, it's going to hurt their overall traffic. So that's the second big implication of not managing this correctly. A lot of these opaque and unfair royalty models will also start to lead to a lot more lawsuits and a lot more legal confrontations and negative press. And this again will impact their service reputation. So this is another big area that they should be worried about, because every time somebody sues Spotify, they have to go and defend it. But it's not the cost of the lawyers. It's again the impact on their service reputation, which seems to be getting quite damaged. And let's go back to why trust is really important. Listeners and artists are putting their information onto the Spotify platform, and that might be their choice of what they want to listen to, or it might be their music, or maybe their contact information. But now with the UK legislation that Ofcom are now regulating, which is all about, child protection, and users will then have to start to put things like their face or their IDs onto the Spotify platform. And if they don't really trust Spotify's practices, then they won't want to do that. And instead they'll turn to other bigger companies like maybe Apple or Google, where they already have more trust in their platforms. And if licensing still continues to be a problem, this is also going to present a challenge for signed artists, which will then have a knock-on effect on the large labels that Spotify relies on. And on a cultural level, if they keep pushing AI over real music, what's going to happen is people will not want to listen to the music that's on there, not knowing whether it's an AI or a real musician that's generated that music. So there needs to be a clear distinction between the two. Otherwise, what will happen is, once again, people will lose trust in the music that they listen to, not knowing whether it was generated by AI or whether there's a real connection or a real artist behind that music. And I, as a listener, want to make sure that I know what I'm listening to, because maybe I want to go and see them live. And if they're not real, i.e. they're AI, I'd like to know that up front. And that's just a basic courtesy, common sense thing. If you're hiding whether artists are AI or not, then to me it seems kind of shady as well. And as a listener, I find that highly offensive. And let's talk about some of the early effects of some of these things. So you may not know this, but in late 2024, Neil Young decided he was going to pull his whole catalog off Spotify. And we've seen big name artists before, like Taylor Swift, do this. But that had a big impact on listeners actually leaving the platform because they couldn't get the music that they wanted to listen to. Since Neil Young pulled out, this has sparked a number of artists boycotting Spotify. There's been a number of other big name artists who have pulled out, and the number seems to be growing. And at first it might be a trickle, but if Spotify doesn't deal with this issue, it will soon become a flood. So what I don't understand is, how is it that Spotify isn't aware of these pretty massive failings? Like, when Spotify has endured all these like super negative headlines, that they wouldn't come to the table to go, hey, let's go and negotiate with artists and let's go and deal with some of these issues and try and come up with some solutions. Speaking of rewarding creators, do me a favor, if you're enjoying this video, please subscribe to the channel, and back to the video. And even if they win in court, they still don't win the artist's mindset. For example, in response to the whole big debacle about the royalty payments and the bundling, a lot of independent artists and other signed artists have formed a coalition to try and bring Spotify back to the negotiation table to start to really talk about how they can adopt maybe some more user-centric pricing or some artist-centric pricing that really rewards artists for the work that they put in on the platform. So let's look at what Spotify would need to do to fix some of these pretty major problems. The first area would be to adopt a more artist-friendly position on how they reward artists for their contributions. And they should also include part of that a reward scheme for new artists coming onto the platform who are really having to put a lot of effort to really break into the industry. And they should be encouraging that early green shoots activity. The second thing is that they really need to crack down on some tools that are going to help with things like fraud prevention and have proper verification for artists. And rather than just rely on third-party DSPs or distributors to do that for them. And I know that they were going to then fine these distributors if they didn't police their own side of the fence. The whole model is broken. And really, that should all sit with Spotify. And it also feels like that they're working with DSPs in a bid to try and avoid culpability, to say, well, we don't know what the end amount that they get because it has to filter through the aggregator and things like that. And it just leads to a more opaque and unfair system. And all Spotify needs to do is take more ownership and accountability for how the platform is actually run and what content is actually on their platform. The other area is to invest in innovation. They could be using innovation to go and drive not only this fraud prevention use case, but also to develop better user experience for the listeners. Because ultimately, if the content is terrible, then people aren't going to want to listen to AI slop. So they're going to need to police the type of content that they have, and as part of that they can clean up all of the fraud, because ultimately all of that innovation that they could be pumping into the platform, and they could use AI to do that, by the way. AI is really good at fraud prevention, especially with machine learning tools, and they could provide listeners with a much better experience with things like a better shuffle system and so on and so forth. And the question still remains, why aren't they wanting to do that? Is it because the problem's too big, or is there something potentially more nefarious at play? And this is what the result of Spotify not taking accountability and ownership for their own content means. It means people start to question the authenticity and the desire and intent of Spotify to actually do something about this. Because if they don't want to do something about it, it kind of puts them in the frame as being part of the problem rather than the solution. Is it by not investigating the total number of artists on the platform properly to understand which ones are bots, which ones are AI, which ones aren't, that in effect they might actually implicate themselves? And it begs the question, why aren't they going and looking at their user data more closely? Is it because they know that it's really bad? Or is it because maybe they're contributing to the fake bots and the fake streams and all of that? Because otherwise, why wouldn't they want to clean up their act? At the end of the day, if they're posting to their board and to shareholders in their annual report fake numbers, well then ultimately they will be found out for that. When Volkswagen, for example, were reporting bad emissions, it only took one whistleblower to actually come out and say that they were fake. And Volkswagen's share price took a massive knock. So if it turns out that Spotify's artist lists, or the number of listeners that they have, or the number of streams are being juiced or artificially increased in some way, well then it implicates the company in the fraud. So why wouldn't they want to police and be compliant with these things? Because ultimately there's a lot of money and a lot of royalties at stake. And really, they need to do a better job around this. Again, all it takes is one whistleblower and they're toast. So what can we do about this situation? As artists, we have a voice. We can organize and we can put together coalitions of artists to go back with recommendations and requests back to the company. We can sign petitions. We can do all of these different things. We can pull our music off Spotify or put it on in a reduced form and explore things like direct-to-fan options. We don't just need to rely on Spotify to sell our music. And as I said, there's so many artists that are actually pulling their music off Spotify altogether just because they've had enough. And if we're clear on what we want Spotify to do, so things like being more accountable, managing fraud, showing and providing more visibility of what's actually going on the platform, stop delegating all of these things to the DSPs and making them accountable. They are accountable for their own things. And the other thing is sitting down with artists and actually working with them to come up with creative solutions around how artists get paid. And they can also work on early artists and help them with things like education, advocacy, support to get new artists onto the platform that aren't just tied to the major large labels. As artists, we can also educate ourselves properly around the economics involved in streaming and how it actually works. Who's making the money, who's not making the money, and how are things getting diluted? Because then by understanding that, then you can start to make better decisions around where to put your music and why and how and in what form. The other thing is you can voice your feedback directly back to Spotify, write to them, do surveys, and share with them that you're not happy with, one, the listening experience or the way that artists are being treated. And for Spotify, you should immediately commission a review of all of your own data and review a lot of your fraud controls to make sure that you are identifying fraudulent behavior accurately using tools like AI and machine learning to do it. Not just hold the DSPs accountable. That's not good enough. You need to police your own data. You also need to commission a review on how you're going to deal with the notion of verification and AI artists, because right now that's causing a lot of stress for musicians and they're really questioning whether they want to be part of the system anymore. If the intent is to monetize AI content, then that's going to have a very different perception for real artists than if you have a distinction between real and AI artists. You also need to sit down with real artists and understand how little they make and also come up with solutions, because you created this situation to begin with. You were the one that went out and developed these like all-you-can-eat models, which then disrupted the market and caused other vendors to then have to follow suit. iTunes was very happy selling single songs for $1. So not having accountability for fixing this problem for artists sits squarely on your shoulders, Spotify. You should also launch public and fan roundtables to really show that you are listening to their concerns and doing something about it, and then report back on the progress. Like Bandcamp did exactly this. They got everybody together and they took all of the feedback and all of the recommendations and then showed a regular report back to all of its stakeholders, not just its shareholders, but all of its stakeholders, exactly what it was doing to solve some of these problems. You should also really review your values, because you need to double down on transparency and trust and accountability, because these are the things, Spotify, that are really letting you down. And when it comes to R&D investment, there are many ways to drive efficiency, but you really need to look at how you're improving the user experience for both listeners and artists on the platform. There are so many ways that you can make it easier for artists to join without having to go through the rigmarole of going through a DSP. And you could have walled gardens for each of the different types of users and share, for example, these are new unsigned artists that are coming up and being filtered, and you can use AI to help filter some of this noise instead of actual real bodies. But there's so many things that you can do, and you're just not doing enough. In 2024 and 2025, musicians gathered in a forum to create a day of action to really lobby government and companies to do better when it comes to transparency and fair pay. The intent of this was to drive positive change. One viral campaign, #JusticeForSongwriters, worked to gather feedback and provide that straight back to Spotify, with thousands of listeners pledging to contact Spotify about these issues. The growing momentum is forcing the dialogue with Spotify, and hopefully this will result in more action. This should be a conversation that's done not in private but in public, to show exactly what the future looks like for the music industry. Spotify started as a grassroots movement, with listeners wanting more and Spotify wanting to offer them something fairly unique. So this is where that grassroots piece needs to come back in. It almost feels like Spotify's lost its way. If Spotify acts now, artists will benefit from fairer, more transparent rules, and other things like better support and better opportunities for discovery of new music. If we don't do this, the music industry will become stale. Listeners will enjoy a better experience, richer, more diverse, thriving, exciting. That's the kind of thing that people really want. Spotify will not only recover its reputation, but it will also maintain its brand leadership. And it will have an opportunity to innovate with new groundbreaking types of licensing and streaming models, which can only push the industry higher. Spotify can go from the villain to the hero of the story, showing exactly how they led the way through this turbulent time. In countries where they trialed new types of licensing and royalty payment models, like for example with Deezer in France, the result was that creators and fans had much better connection, and in general the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. This pilot became a really great example of what's possible when all parties are striving towards the same goal. So hopefully that's been interesting. We've done a full investigation of all the things to fix the world when it comes to Spotify. So if you enjoyed this video, please check out some of the other content, and I look forward to seeing you in other future videos. Thank you very much.